Welcome. Ujari Gamurua. My name is Erin, and I'm the Biosecurity Sector Lead in the Atlas of Living Australia. And I wanted to thank so much for your interest in attending this webinar titled Protecting Australia's Ecosystems, Novel Approaches to Biosecurity Management. Today we've got 3 fabulous speakers lined up who are all working in the field. But before I begin, I wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're all joining from today. For me, I acknowledge the Gadigal of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of this place we now call Sydney. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that recognition across the lands on which we're all meeting today. Let me know where you're dialing in from via the chat function. So before we begin, just some quick housekeeping and information on how this session will run. First of all, this session is being recorded, and I'll introduce each of the 3 speakers who have about 10 to 12 minutes, and this will be followed by a question and answer period. On the right-hand side of the screen, there is a chat function and a question button, and we have lots of time set aside for questions, so I encourage you to pose your questions throughout the webinar. If you want to change your view of the slides or the speakers, there's a small button at the bottom of your screen with a person on it, and this changes the size of what is being displayed. And we also have a quick poll with a few questions that will pop up about now, and it'd be great if you could fill it in before you drop off the call. And this just lets us know your affiliation and how to improve our webinars on an ongoing basis. All right, let's kick this off with our first speaker. Our first speaker is Alexander Schmidt-Leboon, and Alexander is a CSIRO scientist at the Australian National Herbarium in Canberra, where he leads the plant systematics and population genetics team. His research interests include phylogenetics, taxonomy, and biogeography, and the application of computer vision to species identification and collection science. Alexander's work mobilizes collection specimens and their DNA and label data to understand the evolution of Australia's biodiversity, to produce identification tools, and to support conservation, biosecurity, and biological control. Over to you, Alex. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction and for giving me the opportunity to speak here. Please let me know if my sound isn't working or if the screen sharing isn't coming through. As you said, I'm going to talk today about mobile identification of biosecurity threats, and you may perhaps wonder why, as a botanist working at the Australian National Herbarium, there's an insect on my title slide, but I hope that will become clear in due course. So the background of this and why I ended up in this mobile identification space is that identification is critical in a variety of fields, and that includes, in this case, biosecurity. So we've got increasing risk of incursions from trade, travel, people, moving things around. And in many cases, both for decision making and for documenting, that you can do pathway analysis, for example, it is important to identify the interceptions and to do so fast and with a high degree of confidence. The earlier we detect something, the more likely we are, to eradicate it or keep it from establishing in the first place. We need to obviously be careful with the kind of the work, the attention of the taxonomists. There are very few specialists around that can confirm identifications. And then also you need to know what you've just cleaned or destroyed, for example, if you want to really understand what happened. Unfortunately, the most frequently found traditional identification tools are either text-based identification keys like this one here on the right. So this is, the traditional dichotomous key that taxonomists have been produced for decades. The problem with this is, first of all, it's single entry. So if whatever character it asks for in the first question isn't available on your specimen, then you are a bit stuck. And the other thing is you need to understand the morphological terminology, which can be quite complicated for some groups. You can simplify that to a certain degree, but there are some things for which just simply, to be precise, you need to have a special term and you need to spend some time learning those. And the alternative are image collections, like kind of image-based field guides, which again have got a barrier of entry in that you need to understand at least how to narrow things down, where to start looking, because it's no use obviously using an image collection with 50,000 species in it if you don't know, how to narrow that down. So as you will know, in CSIRO, we have got the National Research Collections, a group of 6 biological collections with specimens, in total approximately 15 million specimens that are expertly curated with confirmed identifications. And we have also got quite a lot of investment in imaging capabilities. So we've got stackshot cameras for insects, for example. We've got a 3D camera. We've got microscopy cameras. We've got, systems that can photograph herbarium specimens. And so in about 2018, we asked ourselves if image recognition, if image classification had matured to the degree where we could actually build next generation identification tools for mobile identification using our specimen images and artificial intelligence. And we therefore partnered up with Microsoft and co-invested into the prototype that is kind of at the core of this presentation that you can see here. I had just come out of a project developing a traditional text-based identification tool for the Department of Agriculture at that time, which was on wheat seeds. So the first prototype identification model that we developed for that was just, with a limited number of 17 species of wheat seeds, including, for example, Scotch thistle and plantain and a few others. And we had this app developed for us, which I'm just going to walk through very quickly here what it can do. So you've got a identification interface. This is fairly standard. You may be familiar, for example, with Seek by a Naturalist, which is really fun to use with your family on a bushwalk. So this does something slightly similar, only it's a lot more interactive in how it tells you what the AI model is thinking, how certain it is. And you're just one tick away from a species profile that you can see there on the right with an example image and potentially linked to other information, in this case, Atlas of Living Australia profile of that species, that you can kind of second guess whether the AI has got it right or whether you want to go back and try again. You've got a function, actually I should say here, you see the save button in the left picture. If you click that, you get an instantaneous record created. And you can see here on the right what that involves. So there's a photo of what the camera has seen at that moment, so you can document your observation. It shows where it has been taken with coordinates, potentially even with an address if the software was able to deduce that. And it puts the time that you've made the observation into the file name, and you see what the AI thought at the bottom. So it's identification estimate there. And then the idea would be, if this prototype gets turned into, a deployed app, there's the button in the upper right corner, which you can then upload that observation record somewhere. So this was our idea. Obvious advantages here, you can do without the specialist terminology. You see an image, you hand it over to the AI, or in this case, the live video feed of your device. It is like a taxonomist looking over your shoulder and saying, oh yeah, I don't think that's what this person has claimed it is, or yeah, I think it's this, but we may want to look at a bit more information to ensure that. It works without network coverage, so the AI model is compiled into the app. You can use that anywhere. And because it is compiled into the app, you also don't have any ongoing costs once you've deployed it. There's no micropayments for every identification that you're undertaking. And so we then started talking to people, showing them this prototype and saying, this is something we can do. Where would that be useful? And this resulted in 2 projects that I just want to quickly mention here. The Department of Agriculture and Water and the Environment, who I'd worked with before, as I said, on seed identification, they had a particular problem in 2019 with stink bug invasion in the Sydney area. So that was what was on everybody's mind. And so in 2019-20, we then teamed up and got funding through the Biosecurity Innovation Program. Our partner there was the Australian Chief Plant Protection Office to do a feasibility study on stink bug identification. And we used photos, from over 200 specimens in the Australian National Insect Collection, CSIRO, and more than 500 specimens from interinstitutional loans, usually overseas, where the pests live that we're worried about getting into Australia or not. We produced thousands of training images, trained a custom vision model on 4 pest species and 5 native species. And in the computer, this model is working quite well. It's 99.8% accurate. But that is, of course, not the real test. We then also want to see what it does when it's in the mobile format, when we've compiled it into the app and point that at specimens. And just very quickly, you can see the results here. It's working quite well with the pest species that we're worried about. The brown marmorated stinkbug, which is a particularly critical concern, is marked in red here. It struggles a bit with 2 of the native species, but this was a very, very promising first prototype feasibility study. And so this year, 2021-22, we're expanding this model to about 40 stinkbug species based on a priority list from the department. And we're expanding our feasibility study to non-European honeybees that might come into the country. We have licensed this prototype source code to the department, who are conducting user testing and business analysis on how to integrate such a solution into their systems. And we're continuing this collaboration into the next year. Then the other project is the weed scan project. So here we are one of the main partners in this land care funded project managed by the Center for Invasive Species Solutions, which is going to produce a first national identification and reporting app for priority weed species. My team is doing the weed photography, the AI model, and supervising the app development. The Atlas of Living Australia is also involved in this project. And then the other partner doing development is New South Wales DPI, who are doing the web services, website, database. Just show what we've come so far. This is the prototype weed scan website developed in New South Wales. And then here on the right, you can see our first identification interface prototype for the weed scan app, which has got its first model in there. And you can see this is a screenshot that I took on my cell phone on my way to home when I came past the thistle to test it out. So this is the talk itself. I haven't really had an eye on the watch here. I was just wondering if there's still a minute left, whether I could quickly show a video showing the app in action.
That's fine.
Thank you. So this is a little demonstration video that I've made. I'm just going to voice over now. You can see how as you go in, you zoom in, you bring the specimen in focus, and then you get an identification estimate at the bottom. In a phone that has got the light, you can actually turn the light on to get some support there. If you then click on the species that is being displayed, you get a species profile. And then just to drive home again, this is not about just blindly trusting the AI. This is an interactive process. So here I'm zooming a bit closer. You can see how as you move around, as you try out different parts of the insect, and then if you go away from it, you can see how the app constantly updates its identification estimate to tell you what it thinks, and you can try the other side, you can show it more of the head, etc., etc. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was really fascinating. And I can see a few questions starting to roll into the chat, to the question box rather, but please keep those questions coming for the end of the session. I'll now introduce you to our second speaker. Andrew Turley leads the Strategy Directorate for the National Red Imported Fire Ant Eradication Program within the Queensland Department of Agriculture and Fisheries. Having joined the program in 2019, Andrew leads the development of the program strategies, the implementation of its science, policy systems and intelligence, and communications and engagement functions. Prior to joining the Fire Ant program, Andrew led Project DIG at the Queensland Museum Network, as well as multiple projects for the World Mosquito Program within Australia and abroad. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for coming today. All right, so I've chosen today to talk to you about how we use data to eradicate fire ants and prove it. So first, a bit of introduction to fire ants. So fire ants are one of the world's most invasive ants. They were first detected in Brisbane in 2001. We actually suspect they might have been here for 10 years even before that. In Australia, there's no natural predators, and there are highly aggressive and dangerous ants. So all of these photos here, you can see some idea where they can bite you. When they bite you, they swarm you and cause multiple stings. If you have anaphylactic shock, it can actually be fatal. But they also have impacts on our native wildlife and our social amenity. They infest parks and open areas like that, so it makes you hard to go out and play, have your barbecues. Also, they have significant impacts on agriculture. They destroy crops, they attack livestock. Because of the severity of these potential consequences, a national eradication program has been in place since 2001. And we've been trying to stop their spread ever since. So this map here just shows you a little bit of the potential spread if the national program hadn't started in 2001. So since then, we've been fighting. They have continued to spread, and you can see in the blue area there where they're out to, which is out into the Lockyer Valley, north up into sort of Moreton Bay and south into the Gold Coast now. But that's significantly less than if the national program had not started way back in 2001. Critical to be able to eradicate ants, though, is being able to find them and know where they are. If you can't find them, you can't eradicate them. So today I'm going to talk to you about the three key sorts of surveillance that we actually use to do this. So one being public reports, two being the remote sensing technologies, and three being genetics. So how do we actually find ants? Well, we've had almost 60,000 reports of fire ants come in from the community, and almost every known colony of ants out there has come in from the public reporting fire ants. So we have a large communication campaign that goes out raising awareness of fire ants in areas where we suspect they are. And we have tools. This is our website here, fireants.org.au, where people can go in and report fire ants. As part of that process, you can actually upload photos of the ants. And once we start to get a report in, that's when we go into a bit of a vetting. So if we get photos, we'll look at those photos and be able to determine, does it look like a fire ant or is it something else? If we don't have photos, we might send out mail out a kit for people to take a sample themselves and send it back in, and we can have a look. And all of that is managed through a system we called Cases, but it's essentially a Microsoft Dynamics CRM system. If we do find that one of those public reports is fire ants, that's where we go into really what the backbone of the fire ant program is. And this is the Fire Ant Management System, or FAMS. So this system contains all reports of fire ants since 2001. So that's something like 50,000 confirmed locations with fire ants on them out there. It's not just a repository though. So it also is used for job allocation. So we'll actually plan what the treatment might be, where it is, and then that's assigned to field staff, and they actually use a mobile application out there in the field with tablets to be able to go out and record what treatment they're actually doing, what did they find while they were out there. But if we just take a step back, we talked about the ability to send in photos. And since 2003, we've had about 10,000 photos come in from the public of suspected fire ants. As an entomologist myself, it's quite pleasing to see that 95% of people can identify an ant from some other insect. So that's a really great result when we actually look at that. But what do we actually do with all this data? This data is not necessarily the core of what we're looking for, but there's still value in it. So firstly, if anyone wants to look a bit more, there's actually a paper here published back in 2019 by Melinda McNaught, Ross Wiley, and Bob Bell. And that essentially lists all the different types of genuses of insects that we found through the fire ant program, and gives you some estimates of how accurate the community are actually identifying fire ants through all the work that we've been doing over the last 20 years. But rather than just a token, this is interesting, we also get from this data, we get an idea of the local presence. So if we don't get a public report, we don't necessarily know that fire ants are in a particular suburb. And this is critical for things like biosecurity zones that restrict the movement of materials that could carry fire ants. Public reports can also be an index of density. If we get lots of reports of fire ants in a small area, that suggests that there's a high density of fire ant nests in that area. But there's also a question of, if you get public reports and you don't have fire ants, can that be used for local absence? And for a number of years, we thought that no, you couldn't. The absence of evidence isn't the same. But there's a bit of research coming out more recently, and with some of from Tasman Lee and Michael Bode. Michael Bode actually sits on our scientific advisory group as well, that you can actually start to use this to give evidence that no, fire ants are not in the area if you keep getting reports coming in, but they're not confirmed as fire ants. There's one problem with public reports though, and that is that the public doesn't live everywhere. In urban areas, public reports are really good, really great data to know where the ants are. But in your rural areas, we need a way to be able to go out and find them in farmers' fields, in lots of land where people aren't, inhabiting. And that's where our remote sensing work starts to come in. So remote sensing essentially involves strapping a camera to the bottom of a helicopter, flying around and taking lots and lots of photos. So we actually have 7 spectral bands that we use when we're going out doing our remote sensing image capturing. Once we have those images, they're processed. And I should add, these are all done in collaboration with our a commercial partner, Outline Global. Those images are then run through an artificial intelligence that's looking for fire ant nests. So it basically goes through, the first wave is looking for objects in the landscape, and then it classifies that with a confidence level of how likely is this going to be a fire ant nest or not. So we've been doing this for about 10 years and continuing to develop this technology. And this is where we're at the moment, where we're getting up to 63% precision and 47% recall. Now, these are sort of the best results in areas where we've been, in environments, I should say, where we are trained. We've gone in there before, this is a familiar environment. It drops down much lower in environments we haven't been before, often closer to 25% precision and recall. But even with those lower levels, we still think there's a lot of value in there. And I'll come to that a little bit later when we start to understand the spread dynamics. And if we do multiple years of flying across the area and we continue to see absence of fire ants, our confidence in the absence of fire ants or the presence of fire ants can increase. And this just finally is a bit of a map. All of the grids that you can see here are actually where we're planning to fly with our remote sensing next year as part of our surveillance work. Sorry, not next year, this winter. So we're going to be flying about 60,000 hectares of remote sensing surveillance to see if we can detect fire ants throughout all this area where we've been eradicating for a number of years. So the other key tool is genetics and understanding the genetic relationships of different fire ant nests. And probably our star in genetics is the eradication that occurred in Gladstone. So although we've got fire ants in Brisbane, we also continue to have importation of fire ants from overseas into other locations in Australia. And most recently in 2013, we had an infestation in Gladstone that the national program was responsible for responding to. So basically the team went in, they did a big wave of ground surveillance looking for nests. And when they went in, they found 66 nests and they sampled from each of those nests. By then analysing the genetics of the ants within there, we were able to determine that it looked like there were 2 founding queens that were originally imported from overseas, and there's been 7 subsequent generations from that original importation. The genetics also predicted that there should have been about 75 nests. Given that we found 66, this gave us really high confidence that we'd actually found pretty much every nest that was out there. This was only possible because of the level of surveillance that we actually did. It was every square metre was searched to find these. Some nests also you can't detect. They don't necessarily build their mounds on top, so there could have been other ants out there. So we just did a wide-scale treatment to ensure that we actually eradicated them over time. So I mentioned before, what we also learn from looking at the genetics is the spread dynamics of fire ants. So over multiple generations, by tracking the genetics of different fire ant populations we've found, we can start to predict how far will they spread, what sort of directions will they spread, and what does the spread pattern actually look like. And we can use that once we've actually got a model of the spread to start to plan our surveillance. So if you think about, we've got to put a grid over the entire area of Brisbane, we cannot go in and sample every single square kilometre. So we need a way to be able to go and do subsampling and then know what those results actually mean. So this has been developed now into our proof of freedom model that we're employing to be able to estimate the confidence that we should have from our surveillance results as to whether our treatment and eradication work has been successful or not. Our genetics also gives us really good understanding of the movement of ants around where they're infested by people. So this map here is showing you each of those green dots represents a fire ant nest. And this is from a location called Tyrone, which was essentially an emergency response about a year ago, because this was a location about 7 kilometres beyond any known fire ant nests. Fire ants naturally will only spread about 5 kilometres. So the alates that come out of the colony and fly, their maximum dispersal distance is 5 kilometres. This was beyond that. So straight away we suspected, someone's moved a fire ant nest into Tyrone. So we went in there and did our surveillance. We found more nests. We took samples from each of those. What we quickly found, though, is that this wasn't just one movement of one fire ant queen into this area. It was multiple fire ant queens, and we had multiple genetic lineages. And this can tell us that there's been movements of materials that carry fire ants outside of the area multiple times. So we had a bigger problem here that we need to go into this community, talk to them about how to actually stop fire ants coming into your area, what materials move them, what you need to do to make sure that you can keep your property free from fire ants. And then scaling that up with all the data from all the fire ants we've collected from, we've done genetics, I'll say, on most of the samples that we've ever taken. We can start to map what does the population genetics look like of fire ants across Southeast Queensland. And in here, each of these different colours represent a different population or cluster of fire ants that we have found. And what we can tell from this is we start to understand what sort of intermixing of these different clusters do we see. If there's lots of intermixing, that suggests that there could be lots of human-assisted movement and our movement controls are not working. It also suggests that the fitness of the ants could be increasing because historically they've been quite separate, suggesting we've been doing a good job of keeping them separate, and their fitness could be lower because they're starting to inbreed. So this is a critical indicator when we look at this to go, how effective are we being in the work we're doing? It also helps us detect things like, if you look in the far left corner, you can see a couple of blue dots. And they're real big concerns where it looks like we've had movements of, say, 40 kilometres of fire ants from the other blue area. So lots of things that we learn from this and helps us focus and make decisions on where we invest our treatment and movement control efforts. And finally, if you want to know more, head over to fireants.org.au. Thank you, everyone, for the time today.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was great. All right, let's move on to our last speaker. I can see lots of questions rolling in, so I want to save as much time as possible to get to those. So Paul Tudman is a data and analytics specialist with over 20 years of experience working on large-scale projects for state and federal governments and academia. As the project manager for Biosecurity Commons, Paul is responsible for leading a highly skilled team of software developers, scientists, and communicators to build powerful decision support tools for biosecurity using cloud-based technology. Biosecurity Commons is set to launch in April 2023 and will deliver a cloud-based decision support platform for modeling and analyzing biosecurity risk and response. Over to you, Paul.
Excellent. Thanks for the introduction, Erin. And I don't think we could have actually had a better couple of presentations leading up to this. I think Andrew and Alexander did a great job of leading into the sort of modelling that I'll be talking about today. But just to start with, I'd like to step back a little bit and look at the big picture and just talk about the biosecurity challenge that's currently upon us and why we're investing so much time and energy in solving these challenges. So one of the biggest risks to us right now from a biosecurity perspective is globalization. So people, goods and produce are moving around the globe at rates greater than ever before. And it might surprise you that even during a global pandemic when humans pretty much stopped moving, trade only dropped by about 25%. So it's pretty amazing. We were still pushing ships, containers, planes with goods all around the globe while that was happening. So those biosecurity risks were still there. They didn't go away, even though humans stopped moving around. So I guess to solve this challenge, there's two options. We either stop moving so many humans and goods around the globe, which is very unlikely. The other approach is to start using our data and information more wisely to solve the biosecurity challenge. And that's what our project is all about. And some of you might have seen this invasion curve before, but basically what it represents is that if you stay to the left-hand side of this curve and you look at prevention, which would mean no incursions of invasive species, or early detection, where we actually have a chance to eradicate them, that's a good scenario. As we move towards the right-hand side and it starts getting red, invasive species get out of control. And I guess just like Andrew was talking about there, managing them or trying to eradicate or control them is probably going to cost a lot of money, and your chances of actually eradicating them reduce significantly. So what we really want to do is stay at this lower end of the curve. And we're building models and tools that'll help try and keep Australia at that bottom end of the curve. So what's the current situation look like in modelling of biosecurity challenges? So on the left, we have seen cases where people have very little information, very little resources, and we've spoken to those people and they feel like they're throwing darts at a dartboard. Some people are lucky to have a bit more money to throw around. They hire external consultants, they go away, do some complex analysis. You come back, you get a nice report, but you probably don't have access to any of the underlying data or IP for that particular project. And then the third scenario, if you're lucky to have a bit of a computer nerd like myself floating around, you can go away, code up some workflows and come back with some pretty complex analytics. But chances are not many people understand what you've done. But what all these have in common is you're not actually building capacity within your organization to solve the increasing biosecurity challenges. And that's what our project is working towards, is increasing capacity and providing generic tools that can solve biosecurity challenges. And no surprise, I guess, happens in all particular disciplines, and biosecurity is no different. The silos exist, so silos within projects and also silos within data, and these are holding us all back. So our project is also trying to overcome the problem of the silos that we've created and are holding us back. So in a nutshell, our project, we're building a cloud-based decision support platform for modelling, analysing biosecurity, risk and response. And over the next 10 minutes, I'll describe what that looks like and what we're going to achieve over the life of the project. So the Biosecurity Commons platform is going to offer 6 key features to address some of those challenges that I've just mentioned. So the first one is offering intuitive point-and-click web-based interface. So gone are the old days where you have to go and download special software. The sort of analytics we'll provide will be available through a web interface, so no special installations. You'll have access to high-performance computing, meaning you don't have to keep going asking your boss for more RAM to keep for your desktop computer to keep doing complex analytics. We'll be offering repeatable scientific workflows that have gone through a process where they've been endorsed by our expert panel, and they've also been peer-reviewed as well. And we'll provide access to thousands of online data sets through a number of different data repositories that I'll talk a little bit about later. You'll have a secure online workspace. And finally, you have access to cloud storage for your results and also capability to share those results within the platform. So during the life of our project, we're going to deliver 7 new workflows that will help solve biosecurity problems. So the first 2 on the left are being developed in collaboration with our sister project. So EcoCommons, also based at Griffith University, they're developing species distribution modelling and risk mapping. So those 2 are already well underway, and we actually have a demonstration that we did at a conference a couple of weeks ago of an early design of the platform. So they're well underway. Our project is focusing on the 5 new workflows that are being developed on the right-hand side. So being surveillance design, dispersal modelling, impact analysis, resource allocation, and proof of freedom. And now we'll just have a bit of a closer look at what do those 5 workflows represent. So the first workflow is called dispersal modelling, and that's a bit like what Andrew was talking about before, like trying to predict, once you have an incursion, where that species might spread to. So this particular workflow will let you run simulations through time, and you can start modelling where a pest or disease might spread through the environment. And you can see this little example I've put here. You can imagine we've had an incursion on the Queensland coast, and through time, that invasive species has spread throughout the environment. The second one is based around surveillance design. Surveillance design is all about where we should look. And I guess mainly it's about early detection. So typically we're talking about post-border responses, and these areas would be located around our ports and airports where we're importing goods to Australia. And we can start modelling where things might spread to, but also what sort of surveillance that we would undertake to stay at the bottom of that invasion curve that I mentioned earlier. The third one is impact analysis, and this is leading on to the other workflows where if we know where the model where a species might spread throughout the environment, then we can start overlaying other data and calculating the impact. In this example, we can start looking at economic, environmental or social impacts and start modelling that. So we could come up with a dollar figure, what would likely happen if we don't respond to an incursion, such as fire ants. We would be able to predict how much that might cost our community. Second last one is resource allocation. In this example, you can see we've modelled, we had an incursion over the northern half of Australia, and then we can start modelling to see how much time and how much money it would take to eradicate or control that particular pest. And that's exactly the sort of things that Andrew was talking about before, where we're seeing we've got fire ants in southeast Queensland. Can we start modelling what it looks like to control? And with this workflow, we can start running different scenarios. So start looking at cost-benefit analysis to achieve our management goals. And then the last one is proof of freedom. So this is often the final goal, the final step in biosecurity world. And this is where we want to establish that a region after an incursion is now free of a pest or disease. Or the flip side is we've never actually had that pest in our country before, but we might have to establish area freedom for our export markets. So before we send goods overseas, a lot of countries ask us to prove that we don't actually have that pest because they don't want it in their country. Now, to support those 5 workflows, we're going to have a range of different types of data sets available through the platform. The first one will be online data sets connected via API connections, and they will be things, data repositories like the Atlas of Living Australia, TERN, so GBIF, the CSIRO Knowledge Network, and that list will keep on expanding through time. So these are the first ones that we're tapping into. And they'll provide things like species occurrence records and environmental layers. And then secondly, we also have a range of curated data sets. So these data sets have been pre-processed and they're specifically designed to support those 5 biosecurity workflows that I mentioned earlier. So these might be things like where a data set has traditionally existed as a vector data set, but most of our workflows are based on raster data, and we would pre-process those data sets so they're available to speed up the practitioner's use of these workflows in the platform. And there's also a third option. Of course, you'll be able to upload your own data. So if you've got your own species occurrence records, or you've done some different bits of modeling in a different platform, you can bring that in and use that with our workflows as well. So just what is our scope for our project? So it is initially a proof of concept. So we're basically proving that these sort of complex analytics can be hosted and executed in a cloud environment. Initially, we'll have a focus on environmental biosecurity, and then later iterations of the platform will start looking at plant and animal health as well. They're quite different areas of biosecurity. We'll also have an initial focus on the terrestrial environment, and then later iterations may look towards the marine and freshwater environments as well. And a really big focus of what we're trying to achieve is training and education. Like what we've realized, we really need to build capacity within the biosecurity sector to start responding to these increasing threats. So just a couple of use case examples. So previous talks have mentioned 2 of these already. The first one would be surveillance design workflow. So that's based around early detection, and Alexander mentioned the brown mulleted stink bug, which is a huge threat to Australia. So you could start modelling what surveillance would look for that particular insect. You could also use our impact analysis workflow to model the potential impacts of something like red witchweed, which is a highly invasive weed and has already caused billions of dollars of damage to the agricultural industry in parts of Africa. And then finally, we've already seen about fire ants today, and we know how nasty those little critters are, and we could start using our dispersal modelling workflow to model future incursions of fire ants. But I thought today is a good opportunity to take you through and just look at how some of these steps actually start linking together. And a bit of work has already been done on the spongy or gypsy moth, and we thought we'd demonstrate how you could replicate that sort of work in our platform. So if you're not aware, the spongy moth is a highly invasive species. It isn't present in Australia at the moment, but it presents a huge risk to the agricultural industry, and it has already done a lot of damage in North America. So what would be our first steps in our particular platform if we wanted to start looking at what would we do to come up with some surveillance for this little moth post-border areas? So the first thing we're going to do is create something like a species distribution model, but we're going to need some data. So obviously the insect's not prevalent in Australia at the moment, but we go to one of our data catalogs, and this one here is actually GBIF, or it could be ALA, but we're using GBIF because they had a really good sample size for this particular species. So we can come in here, search for this. I've put the genus and species, so Lymantria, this little guy. We can see that I've got a hit on GBIF, and then I can import those records, and I'll just go to the next slide, and we can visualize those species occurrence records. So mainly predominant in the Northern Hemisphere. They are native to parts of Europe and Asia, but if you look on the right-hand side, you can see they've done a fairly good job of spreading through parts of North America where they've done quite a bit of damage. Luckily, they do prefer temperate regions, and there's no records in Australia, even though they have been spotted here on limited occasions. So now that we've got our species occurrence data, the next step would be to go through and create a species distribution model. So if I overlay that data with some climate data, we come up with area of potential habitat for that in Australia. So the red, orange, yellow areas on the southern parts of Australia show the areas of potential habitat should that insect get here. They're the sort of habitats it's going to gravitate towards. Then we can take that one step further in our platform and start looking at some risk mapping, which is all about establishment likelihood. So we can combine the habitat map that we saw just before with some biotic layers such as vegetation, land use, and also with pest arrival, so pest pathway data. So how is it actually going to get here? And that would be through our ports, through containers, through cars, and also tractors, those sort of things. That's sort of pathways into Australia. And that comes up with a map like that. So once again, orange, red areas are high risk areas. So we've combined all those layers into one. And now we have a map. So we know the areas that we should be looking, giving preferential treatment to if we're going to come up with some sort of surveillance program, if we want to detect the gypsy moth very early on before it actually gets out of control. And I'm just going to zoom into the port of Brisbane, which is about 20 kilometres north of where I'm sitting. And you can see there, that red area is presenting a very high risk area for the gypsy moth because it has potential to come in here through our ports. And then our next workflow, surveillance design, would start coming up with a framework for where we would start putting moth traps for a given probability of detecting that. So we want to manage risk, basically. So these high risk areas, we're going to have more traps, and using this particular workflow, we can come up with a methodology for a given cost and a certain probability of detecting that moth as a management strategy to make sure that we stay at this lower end of the invasion curve. So we want to detect these species very early on before they become a problem and get out of control. So what do we see the future looking like? So those workflows, as that just shown them, they integrate with each other to support decision making. So they're not standalone, they actually solve real world problems. The platform you saw is a nice GUI type interface, very just point and click. So you have very easy access to complex analytics. Being able to share data through the platform works towards breaking down those silos that we've traditionally seen in this discipline. And part of the training and rollout of this will obviously be working towards building capacity within those organisations to respond to biosecurity threats. Just quickly, our project journey. So our project started July last year. We're working towards our first soft launch of dispersal modelling, which would be in August this year. And then we've got another soft launch for surveillance design, proof of freedom around November, and then working towards a final launch in April next year. And just like to give a big shout out to our funding partners. So our project is a joint initiative of the Australian and Queensland governments, and we're also funded by the Australian Research Data Commons. SEVRA is the lead organisation, so based out of the University of Melbourne. Our team and EcoCommons, so our sister project, are based at Griffith University, and we're working very closely with the Atlas of Living Australia to ensure their data is easily accessible through our platform. And just finally, just a special mention, so we've got a website. You can go and look and find more information about our project. You can also follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. And if you ever want to get in contact, we're only an email away. We have a generic email there that a few of us in the team monitor. So we're always happy to look for new collaborations and partnerships, or if you just want to find more information, we also have a newsletter that you can sign up for as well on our website. So thank you everyone for listening. Hope you've enjoyed a quick overview of the Biosecurity Commons project, and look forward to seeing how the discussion goes next. So thank you everyone.
Thank you so much, Paul. Andrew, it looks like you have gypsy moths to worry about now too. All right, I see lots of questions rolling in. So we'll start off with one for Alex. Alex, is the Weed ID app expected to be released for public use, and when is this likely to occur?
Yes, that's the point. Sorry, I should have probably said that's the point of that project. So in contrast to the work we're doing with the department, which is more, for their inspectors, The weed app is meant to be public and freely available. And the project is currently funded through to June next year. So by then, we assume we will have, the first version of this app in app stores. Currently progressing quite quickly along that line.
All right. I'll ask you one more, Alice, while I've got you. The app that you presented, are there any plans to license the app for use to the public or industry? And would licensing be to industry per user or bulk use?
So this prototype app that actually already that I've shown there, that is basically a prototype to demonstrate what we can do. It's a conversation starter. And then how that gets implemented, how that gets operationalized, that really depends on the use case. So in a sense, what the department is going to do is, of course, they have a license now to use that internally, and that will not necessarily become available to the public, because that's then that is going to build a special tool for their inspectors and approved arrangements. And in a sense, although we're starting from a new code base, conceptually, of course, WeedSen is going to be, taking that whole thing down a different route, reproducing that functionality to make it available to the public. So the answer is both, depending on where we're going with this and who needs this. It's no easy answer there.
Okay. No, fair enough. Fair enough. All right, Andrew, we'll move over to you. What is the general treatment considered for fire ants?
So we go out and we apply an insect growth regulator treated bait. So it's like a corn grit. It's quite small, maybe 0.5 centimetre by 0.5 centimetre, and we put them out. Challenge with ants in general is that you've got to get to the queen, not the workers. So the whole intent of the bait is it's out there, the workers collect the bait, they bring that back into their colony and they store it. And then essentially they suck out like the oils that has the IGR in it, and they feed it to the queen. And essentially what the IGR does is sterilizes the queen. So over a number of weeks, that queen's not replenishing all the workers in the colony. It stops the production of, the alates that hatch. So the daughters that hatch, their wings drop off as well, so they're not spreading. And eventually that colony will die. To do that and be successful, though, we have to do multiple treatments, and that's always the challenge. So it's not just get it out once. If it gets in there once, it's done. So about every 2 to 3 months, we're having to put another application out, and sometimes over multiple years, over large landscapes, before we actually start to get success.
Okay. And there's a follow-up to that if there is risk to any native species.
So because of the nature of the bait, the first thing is that going into the actual nest, there's very little risk to native species. I think there's 2 native ants that are affected by the IGR baits in what we've done. But we've also done ecological surveys before and after treatment. And what we consistently find is the ants come back of the native species. So by and large, no. They're also regulated by the Australian Pest and Veterinary Medicine Authority. So we use them safely as per their guidelines. And one of the big ones of the IGR is just it can have effects on poultry. So we make sure there's not chickens around when we're applying bait.
Okay. I'll have one more question, Andrew, then we'll move on to one for Paul. There's quite a bit of interest in terms of what material moves fire ants. And how long monitoring will be undertaken to ensure eradication has been achieved?
Yeah, so fire ants can move in almost anything. Generally, it's soils in particular. So if you've got a fire ant nest and say an excavator picks up some soil, if you're moving the queen, it can go long distances. Mulches can move them as well, gravels, just green waste in general if they get in there. I've also seen where they've actually gone and built their nest in steel pipes. So they're moving in the soil, but if you're moving the steel pipes in that regard, you're moving the fire ants as well. So there's not many environments that they can't actually inhabit, which is one of the big challenges with restricting their movement around. Is it's sort of the best strategy to reduce their movement is to not have the ants there in the first place and do treatment. That's really why we invest heavily in trying to do as much treatment as possible. If we can reduce the humans' movement. And I just forgot the second part of that question, sorry.
Oh, it was just, well, actually, pretty much, you pretty much answered that too.
Okay.
All good. There's so many questions here. I'm just trying to roll through them all. All right, Paul, one question, if it will be free to use once it's developed.
Yeah, so for the life of our project, so the initial, it's basically the proof of concept, it will be free to use. We don't know, so we have 2 years of funding at the moment, and we don't know what the future is beyond that. So we'll obviously have to secure some more funding, but initially, for the life of this project, yes, it'll be free to use. All
right, and a follow-up question to that. Is there any thought to how to include surveillance reports from the biosecurity community, like OzPestCheck, MyPestGuide, etc.? And then one more question. Building modeling capacity is great, but has there been consideration of the long-term funding of this capacity, which you sort of just answered as well?
Yeah, certainly on the first one, so OzPestCheck and that, there has been some early discussions. They currently don't have an API type service where we can tap into their data, but it's certainly something we want to look at, because I think those online repositories I mentioned, they're a starting point, so they're ones that are up and running at the moment, but there's certainly more biosecurity specific ones that are out there. So we're happy to talk to anyone that can provide more data. We don't want to be a data repository so much as ourselves. We're trying to create the framework where you can come in and do the analytics, but we want to try and draw as much data from other locations as possible. So anything on that, we're always keen to see what's out there. And then on the second part, so I guess the long-term funding, we are having discussions already with potential partners. So obviously state and federal government are a key market, I guess, for us. We are offering basically tools all in one place that have never been available before. And we see it's even the feedback we've had is it's a game changer in this space. But we do have a bit of a challenge. We've got 12 months pretty much to secure funding, but we're not sure what the long-term life of this will look like at this stage.
Okay. And how are you considering future climate or climate risk?
Yes, so there is climate modelling data in there as well. So, for example, when you come in to do a species distribution model, you're overlaying climatic data. And so that example I showed, that was just using, an average of I think it was the last 50 years, say, of climate data. But doing that same sort of modelling, you could use climate projection data. So you could go, well, in the next 50 years, what is the likely distribution of the gypsy moth? It prefers cooler climates, so maybe it's going to might be good for Australia. It might start pushing it a bit more south, But yeah, you can certainly incorporate those sort of analytics into our platform at the moment.
Great. Alex, bringing you back in, are there opportunities for AI technology to be incorporated into the automated camera trap surveillance operations, for example, at ports?
People are doing that already. I'm not personally involved, at least yet. I mean, we've just recently been approached by somebody who's heard about our work on bugs and who's actually asked us a question in that direction. When it's very early stages. I know that there's people working on this. My general impression is that what I've seen mostly so far is that very often these kinds of automated, object detection approaches, they generally just tell you in the first instance, there is an infestation here. There's something that we want to remove. There's a risk here. Whereas I'm really primarily working in the area where you say, okay, I've got this one thing right in front of my face and I want to know what it is, which is a bit of a different approach. But yeah, it's clear that a lot of the training images that we can generate with our imaging of our collection, you can also then use if in a kind of a conveyor belt situation where you're bringing lots of things past and the AI just tries to find it, where's Wally? Kind of, you know, it needs the same kind of example images basically then to understand what it looks for. Yeah.
All right. Final question, Andrew, it's for you. First of all, have you used or considered eDNA and sniffer dogs? So those two applications to try and detect fire ants?
Yep. So we already have sniffer dogs. They're our highest sort of sensitivity surveillance. Problem is we're now working over almost 800,000 hectares that are infested with fire ants. And sniffer dogs can sniff out about 1 hectare per day. So that's a lot of dogs that we would need to go and do surveillance everywhere. And essentially their use is restricted because of that. We really try and use them for sort of the most sensitive things that we need. An example might be a report of fire ants in a childcare centre. We'll send the sniffer dogs in because we want to find every nest and to protect those kids and make sure they don't get hurt. Regarding eDNA, it's currently in our innovation pipeline to look at can we find an appropriate use case for them with fire ants. We're still struggling to find that real field use and how it adds, but we're so early in that process still that we just need to get, you know, the right markers, go out and start testing in the field and see where we can and can't detect fire ant DNA.
Terrific. All right, well, we're at time. There's still a few questions that we didn't get through, but maybe I can send them to the individual speakers for follow-up. Please extend our virtual applause to all 3 speakers today, Andrew, Paul, and Alex. I think all the talks were really fascinating and it certainly stimulated some great discussion and questions online. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for attending today. Have a good rest of the afternoon.